The ring arrived in the collection plate on a Tuesday, which was not a day the village of Ashmore expected to receive anything remarkable. The Reverend Mr. Foley found it nestled among the coppers and the single bent shilling that old Mrs. Pratt always contributed with an expression of some personal sacrifice, and he held it to the light of the east window and understood at once that it was not lost by accident. A ring does not unknit itself from a finger and wander. Someone had placed it there deliberately, in the sight of God and the parish register and the candle stubs, and that someone had gone quietly home before the final hymn. He did not know, standing at that window with the light making a small cold star inside the stone, that the woman who had left it was at that precise moment walking the 4 miles to Ashmore Cross in half boots that had been resoled twice, carrying everything she owned in a bag that had once belonged to her mother. He did not know that she had made her decision 3 days before and had spent those 3 days finishing every task she had started, because she was not the kind of woman who left things undone. Her name was Maris Vane, and she had been the Duchess of Eldenmere for 7 weeks and 4 days, and she was leaving before it became 8. She had known, when she married him, that it was not for love. She had been told so directly, which she later came to think was the only honest thing that had been said to her in that house. She had been companion to his grandmother, old Lady Eldenmere, for 2 years. 2 years of reading aloud and managing correspondence and keeping the accounts in the long ledger that lived in the library, and she had made herself quiet and competent and small in the way that women in her position learned to do, not from weakness, but from strategy. The invisible woman sees everything. She had seen plenty. She had seen the grandmother's hands tremble over the letters she could no longer answer, and she had answered them. She had seen the household accounts where they did not balance, and she had made them balance, and she had not mentioned to anyone that she had done so, because the mention would have required explaining how she had found them wrong. She had seen the Duke of Eldenmere, Caspian Aldred, come home twice in those 2 years, once in winter, when he stayed 3 days and sat across the dinner table from his grandmother, with a kind of grief so controlled it looked like coldness, and once in spring, when he stayed one day and left before she had finished laying the breakfast. She had formed no particular opinion of him, except that his hands, when he set down a teacup, set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew his own strength and did not trust it in fine company, and that when he spoke to the under-housemaid who brought the morning letters he spoke to her in the same register he used for his grandmother, which was not nothing. She had been, at that point, 26 years old, without fortune or family of any standing. Her father had been a country solicitor with a good library and a talent for extracting legal sense from bewildering situations, and he had died of a fever when she was 19, leaving her the library, the talent, and nothing else. She had found her position with Lady Eldenmere through a distant connection that had required 3 letters and the calling in of a small social debt, and she had held it through competence alone. She was not plain, exactly, but she had learned early that announcing this fact was not in her interest, and she had adopted a way of arranging her expression and her dress that strongly suggested plainness. It was a useful quality to suggest. The invisible woman, she had told herself on many mornings, outlasts the beautiful one. She had believed it until the morning Caspian Aldred's solicitor, a dry-tongued man named Mr. Groft, arrived at Ashmore Hall with 2 documents and a piece of news that required her to entirely reconsider the terms. Lady Eldenmere had died 3 weeks before. The will had been read. And the will, which Lady Eldenmere had apparently drafted in a state of some tactical clarity, stipulated that the Eldenmere estate, the hall, the farms, the London house, the endowment, passed not to her grandson Caspian outright, but in joint trust to Caspian and his legal wife, provided that wife be in residence at Ashmore Hall within 60 days of the will's reading. If no such wife existed at that time, the estate passed to the next male heir in line, who was Caspian's brother Renwick Aldred, a man Maris had met once for approximately 4 minutes, and had found in that time to be the sort of person who asked servants for things without looking at them. Mr. Groft had laid this before her with the air of a man delivering a weather report. And then he had added, with slightly more animation, that the Duke of Eldonmere had asked him to put a particular question to her before she formed any opinion of the arrangement. The question, read from a folded note in a handwriting she had not seen before, was this: would Miss Vane consent to a legal marriage of practical terms, conducted without pretense of feeling on either side, in exchange for a settlement of £300 per year during the marriage, and a sum of £1,500 outright in the event of his death, or a mutual agreement to dissolve the arrangement? The note had added, in a second paragraph, she suspected Mr. Groft had not been meant to read aloud. She will understand the accounts better than anyone. She should know they are sound. She had read that second paragraph twice. Then she had folded the note along its original crease and handed it back to Mr. Groft and said she would require 4 days to consider, which was not true. She had required approximately 40 minutes, most of which she spent sitting in the window seat of the library she had been cataloging for 2 years and looking at the grounds she had come to know as well as any steward. And then she had thought of Renwick Aldred and his way of not looking at servants, and of the under-housemaid who brought the morning letters, and of the 6 families on the estate farms whose tenancies ran on agreements negotiated by the late Lady Eldonmere with a fairness that would not survive a new landlord who valued arithmetic over persons. She had thought, too, of the £300 per year and the $1,500 outright, which were not romantic reasons, but were honest ones, and she had always preferred honesty to romance. She told Mr. Groft yes on the second day, because she did not want to appear to have decided on the first. They were married at Ashmore Church on a cold Thursday in February, with Mr. Groft and the under-housemaid Agnes as witnesses, and Caspian Aldred had looked at her across the vestry with an expression she had catalogued as relief, which she had found insulting and then, upon reflection, fair. He had said, afterward, on the steps of the church in the thin February sun, with a directness she recognized as characteristic, "I am grateful, Miss Vane, Mrs. Aldred. I am grateful. This is not what I would have chosen, for you or for myself. I hope you will find the house adequate." She had said the house was well known to her. She thought it would serve. He had said good, and they had ridden back to Ashmore Hall in separate carriages because his had arrived first. She had found this, too, to be fair. He was in residence for the first 3 weeks of the marriage, and she had kept the careful distance that had been the implied terms of the arrangement, and he had kept his own distance with what she read as trained expertise. He was polite. He appeared at dinner and spoke with her about the estate accounts, which she had been managing and which she presented to him twice a week in a summary document she had designed herself, because the previous system had required cross-referencing 4 separate ledgers, and she had found it wasteful. He looked at her summaries with the focused attention of a man who respected a well-made thing and made only 3 emendations in 3 weeks, all of which were correct. He asked her once, at the end of the second week, how she had known the Fenwick Farm drainage account was being underreported. She had told him she had noticed the discrepancy between the rainfall measurements in the farm log and the claimed drainage costs, and that she had ridden out on a Wednesday to look at the drainage herself. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, When did you learn to read drainage accounts? She had said her father had been a solicitor with rural clients and had taught her that land was always telling you something if you were willing to get your boots wet. He had looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not quite the relief she had catalogued before, something less settled, and had changed the subject. She had thought, in those 3 weeks, that the arrangement might be managed. She had not thought she was in danger of anything. His brother Renwick arrived on a Saturday at the end of the 3rd week, and Morris had been in the still room. She was cataloging the household medicinals, which had been organized on a system that appeared to have been invented by someone with no particular interest in locating anything, when she heard the wheels on the gravel. She had not met Renwick since those 4 minutes before the marriage, and she went to the window and watched him descend from his carriage, and she noted the thinness of a man who moved as though space were always making way for him. The particular brightness of his clothes in the gray afternoon. The way he embraced his brother on the steps with a warmth that was technically correct in all its expressions. She noted that Caspian, receiving the embrace, went very still in the way she had begun to recognize as his response to things that required him to manage himself. She had gone back to the medicinals and made a note to herself, watch what he handles and does not handle. Renwick Aldred had perfect manners, which was not the same thing as good ones. He spoke to her at dinner that first night with a warmth so precisely calibrated that she felt the whole time that she was being measured. He said, "We are glad to have you among us, Mrs. Aldred. Grandmother was very fond of you. She said she knew Lady Eldenmere had been generous in her regard." He said, with the smile of a man who never needed to raise his voice, fond enough, it seems, to rearrange the family entirely. He said it as a pleasantry, the thing that could not be answered because answering it would make her small. She had reached for her wineglass with a steadiness she counted on the inside to achieve, and said, "Lady Eldenmere had clear intentions. Mr. Aldred, I am sure we all find them so." Caspian, across the table, had gone very still and then, with the precision of a man choosing his word from a full cabinet, said, "Maris is right." The intentions were clear. Renwick had smiled at them both with equal warmth and reached for his own glass, and the subject had passed, and Maris had spent the rest of dinner deciding whether the way Caspian had said her given name, the first time he had used it, was a tactical deployment or something else. She did not decide. She filed it. Renwick's visit was supposed to last a week. It lasted 3, and at the end of it she understood 2 things she had not understood before. The first was that the hostility in that house was not new. It ran back years, to a grief she had not yet been given the particulars of. And that, whatever it was, Renwick's knowledge of it gave him a hold over Caspian that operated below the surface of every dinner conversation, a current she could track but not yet map. The second was that the estate's wine merchant accounts, which she reviewed on the Tuesday of Renwick's 2nd week, contained an irregularity. She found it because she found all irregularities. It was the thing she did. She sat with the account book for an hour, checking her arithmetic, and then she went to the cellar log, and then she went to the last 3 years of comparable accounts in the archive chest in the library, and at the end of 2 hours she had established that the wine merchant had been billing at the Eldenmere account for quantities that exceeded the documented deliveries by roughly 1 barrel in 6, and that this had been the case for 31 months, and that the accounts had been countersigned, a formality she had not known was practice here, something to do with an old arrangement in Lady Eldenmere's time, countersigned each quarter by the estate steward, a man named Croft, who was not the solicitor Mr. Croft, but who shared the first 4 letters of his name, which she found noteworthy for no reason she could yet name. She closed the archive chest and went to the still room and continued cataloging. She told no one. It was not yet time. Caspian found her there an hour before dinner and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the rows of bottles and papers, before he said, "You look like someone untangling a sentence." She said she supposed she was, he said. "May I ask, is there something in the accounts that wants attention?" She looked at him with a care she kept off her face. She said, "There are 1 or 2 things I should like to verify before I bring them forward." He had looked at her with the expression she was beginning to think of as his listening look. Very still, very level, and said, "I see." And then, after a pause that had a particular quality to it, the quality of a man placing a card on the table, "There is something I should tell you." She had said, "Yes?" And the door had opened, not a knock, but Agnes appearing with a message that Mr. Renwick had arrived early to the drawing room and should dinner be moved up, and Caspian had closed the thing he had been about to open and said merely, "We will talk later." He had left, and she had remained in the still room with the shelved bottles and the unfinished sentence hanging in the air like a scent, and she had counted the days to the end of Renwick's stated visit and found that there were 6. He was still there at 6 and 7, and at the beginning of the 3rd week, Maris began to understand that the visit had no intended end. She understood it from the way the household had begun to bend in his direction. Small adjustments, preferences accommodated without being stated, the way a household does when it recognizes a center of gravity. She understood it from the way Mrs. Hatch, the cook, mentioned in passing that Mr. Aldred had requested the blue guest room be made permanent as he would be staying on into the season. She understood it from the quality of silence at dinner, which had changed from the careful neutral silence of 3 people managing polite arrangement into a silence with a shape to it. A shape she recognized as the shape of something that had already been decided without her. She went to Caspian on a Wednesday evening after dinner and found him in the library, standing at the window with a glass he had not touched. She closed the door. She said, "What is it that you meant to tell me in the still room?" He turned from the window. He held the untouched glass and looked at her for a long moment, and she waited, because she had learned that he was a man who needed his words to be ready before he released them. He said, "At last, I married you to spite my brother." She waited. He said, "That is not all of it. It is not most of it. But it is part of it, and you should have been told at the start." She said, "And the rest of it?" He set the glass down on the library table with that deliberateness she had learned to watch for, the glass placed exactly as though its position mattered. He said, "The rest of it I am not yet at liberty to lay before you." She looked at the glass on the table. She said, "Then I shall wait to hear it." He said, with a quiet that was not indifference, "I am grateful for your patience." She said, "It is not patience. I am simply waiting for evidence." He looked at her then, and for the first time, the listening look broke open into something else, not quite a smile, too undefended for a smile, but the beginning of one, and he said, "Of course you are." She left before the silence became something it would need to be named. She had not meant to feel anything by the 8th morning of the 3rd week. She had not planned for Agnes to appear at her door before breakfast with a face the color of undyed linen, clutching a folded letter to her chest and saying, "Ma'am, I think you should know. I was bringing the morning letters as I always do, and there was another letter already, on the tray, and I didn't mean to look, only it was face up, and it was addressed to Mr. Renwick in Mr. Croft the steward's hand. She had taken Agnes very gently by the shoulder and said, "Sit down, please. What did the letter say?" Agnes had swallowed. It said words to the effect that the matter was proceeding as discussed, and that the addition to the last quarter's accounts had been made as agreed, and that he would expect his usual consideration on the 1st of next month. She had looked at Agnes for a long moment. She said, "You read it thoroughly." Agnes said, with a dignity that Maris respected profoundly, "I read it twice, ma'am, to be sure." She had said, "Good. You are going to remember every word." Agnes had said, "I already have." She said, "Yes, I know. Go and have your breakfast." She spent 3 hours in the library archive that morning, and she was thorough. And at the end of it, she had assembled, across 6 account books going back 4 years, a pattern of systematic overcharging in 7 separate accounts: wine, timber, grain supply, candle tallies, stable costs, household linen, and something categorized innocuously as estate maintenance, all countersigned by Croft, the steward, all slightly but consistently wrong in the same direction, all adding, when she worked the full sum, to an amount that was not inconsiderable. She laid each book open at the relevant entry and copied the figures in her own hand into a single document, dated and signed. And then she locked the document in the small chest in her dressing room where she kept her father's letters, because it was the only lock in the house that was hers alone. She went to Caspian at noon. He was in the estate office with Croft, and she waited outside the door, and when Croft left, she went in and said, "Close the door." He did. She said, "The accounts are being falsified." She told him, concisely, what she had found. She watched his face while she told him, and she watched the stillness there become a different kind of stillness. Not the managed composure stillness, but the stillness of a man who has been told something he already knew a piece of and is now seeing the whole shape. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" She said, "I found the wine account 3 weeks ago. I wanted the full picture before I brought it forward." He said, "And Renwick?" She said, "The steward is sending him payments." He said it quietly, the way someone says the name of a thing they have been circling for a long time. He sat down. He put his face in his hands for a moment, and then he took them away and looked at the window. He said, "There is more to this than you know." She said, "Then tell me now," he said, with a grief in it that she was not expecting, that opened something in her chest she would rather not have had opened. "I cannot yet. I need 3 more days. Trust me, 3 more days." She had stood across the office from him and thought, "I have always been the invisible woman. I see everything. I am watching you very carefully." She said 3 days. He said, "Thank you." She said, "I am not doing it for you." He said, "I know. That is why I am asking you." She gave him 3 days, and at the end of them she was a fool, or so it appeared. On the morning of the 3rd day, she came down to find Renwick at the breakfast table, alone with a warmth she had learned to mistrust, and a letter in his hand addressed to her. He said, with the voice that was always softest when it was doing its worst work, "I believe you should know the nature of the arrangement you find yourself in." He slid the letter across the table. She looked at it. It was Caspian's handwriting. She knew it from 2 months of account summaries. She said, not touching it, "What is this?" He said, "My brother is not a cruel man, but he has used you." The letter, which she read in one continuous effort of will while keeping her face entirely still, was to a woman named in it as E. and addressed her as "my dear," and spoke of an arrangement of long standing that the present circumstances complicated but did not alter, and it expressed, in Caspian's careful hand, a continued devotion that the writer hoped she would receive in the spirit it was intended, given the regrettable necessity of the present legal situation. She set the letter down. She picked up her tea. She drank it. Renwick was watching her with the gentle interest of a man who has set a fire and is waiting to see the shape it takes. she said. Where did you find this? He said, among his papers. She said, were you looking for something among his papers? He said, I was concerned for your well-being, Mrs. Aldred, she said. That is kind. She said it with the tone she kept for village gossips and poorly balanced ledgers, and then she excused herself and went to her room. She spent most of the night with the letter and her own assembled evidence, and the small oak chest that contained them both, and the cold arithmetic of what she knew. The letter was his handwriting. She was certain of the handwriting. She was not yet certain of the letter, because she had spent 2 years reading correspondence for Lady Eldenmere, and she knew that handwriting could be reproduced by anyone who studied a sufficient sample, and she had been copying his hand across her summary documents for 2 months, and had noticed, among other things, that he had a habit of crossing his letter T slightly leftward of center, and that the letter E in his hand curved always upward on its final stroke. She held the letter to the candle. The T's were centered. The E's turned down. She held it there a long time, the candle making her eyes water, until she was sure. Then she put it in the chest with the rest. And she thought, with a clarity that was cold and fine-edged as a January morning, 3 weeks. He has been here 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks he has found everything. And if he has found the letters, he has been through the desk. And if he has been through the desk, Caspian knows by now that someone has been through the desk. And Caspian said 3 days. This is the 3rd morning. Something is about to move. She packed her bag. She was not impulsive. She was playing a position she did not yet fully understand, and the oldest rule of playing an unclear position was to secure your own ground first. She could manage from outside the house what she could not manage from inside it, and she had enough to go forward with, and a contact in the village, her father's old correspondent, a retired magistrate named Mr. Queller, who had sent her a wedding gift and a note saying she had only to ask. She had not yet needed to ask. She was going to need to now. She dressed and arranged the room and took the chest. She thought of the collection plate. She thought, it is a public act, in the sight of record, that cannot be undone by a letter. She thought, it is also a statement of price. She went to church before the morning service and placed the ring among the coppers with the deliberateness she gave to all the things that mattered, and she walked to Ashmore Cross. Mr. Queller was a compact man of 70 who had the face of someone who had been told many stories and remembered all of them, and he listened to hers in his chair by the fire, with his eyes closed and his chin on his steepled fingers, and when she had finished he said, "You have the account books?" She said, "I have my own document, copied from them. The originals are at the hall." He said, "And the letter that is not what it pretends to be. You have that also?" She said, "I have it." He said, "Then what you have is enough to begin, but not enough to end." She said, "I know that." He said, "You need the original steward's letters to Renwick." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you need a witness who was present in the house." She said, "Agnes." He opened his eyes. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something. He said, "You came here with the plan already." She said, "I came here with most of it." He said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "A legal forum. Something formal enough that what is said in it stands." He said, "I can convene a trustees' hearing. The estate has named trustees, 2 of them, friends of the old lady, both men of standing, both local." He paused. He said, "Caspian Aldred will have to be there." She said, "Yes." He said, "Does he know you've gone?" She said, "By now." He said, "And you're certain of him?" She looked at the fire. She said, "I am certain of the letter. I am not yet certain of him." but I need him in the room to find out." There was a sound in the drive, a horse, fast, pulled up short, and Mr. Queller said nothing and she said nothing, and the knock at the door came 2 minutes later. And Queller's housekeeper showed Caspian Aldred into the study, still in his riding coat, with the look of a man who had covered 4 miles without resting, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and something in his face did a thing she stored away carefully. He said, and this was the first time she had heard any roughness in his voice, the first crack in the careful register, he said, "You left the ring." She said, "I did." He said, "In the collection plate." She said, "It seemed a clear address," he said, with a quiet that she now understood was not composure but its opposite, the stillness of a man holding a very full vessel. "What I told you I would tell you in 3 days," he said, Maris. "I wrote no letter to E." He said, "E is Eleanor. Eleanor Croft, the steward's sister. She died 4 years ago. She was my grandmother's companion before you. I owed her family a long debt, a kindness, on my part, that her brother Croft decided to collect on rather more broadly than I had sanctioned." He stopped. He said, "The letter is a forgery." He said, "I have the originals from my desk." He held out his hand, and in it were 3 letters, the real ones, and she looked at them but did not take them yet. And she said, "Why did you not tell me this 3 weeks ago?" He said with a bluntness she thought might be the most honest thing she had heard in this house, "Because I had not yet decided if you could be trusted." She said, "And now?" He said, "You left a ring in a collection plate and walked 4 miles with your evidence in a chest. I think you can be trusted." She said, "That is a low standard," he said, and it was the first time she had seen it, not quite a smile, more than the beginning of one, something that went all the way. "Yes, I am setting it higher going forward." Mr. Queller, who had been examining his steepled fingers throughout this exchange with the attention of a man deep in private thought, said, "If you are both quite ready, I believe we have a hearing to convene." The trustees' hearing was set for the following Thursday, which gave them 6 days and the advantage of having moved first. Maris spent 3 of those days in Mr. Sallin Queller's spare room with the account books, which Caspian sent from the hall through Agnes, who arrived on a Tuesday with the books in a market basket under a cloth, and an expression of someone carrying something across a boundary with deliberate innocence. Agnes sat down in Mr. Queller's kitchen and reported every word of the letter she had seen, in order, twice, and signed her name to a document that Mr. Queller's clerk wrote out from her speech, and then she drank her tea and said, "Is there anything else, ma'am?" And Maris said, "Not today." Agnes said, "Then I'll go back and keep my eyes open." She said it with the flat confidence of a woman who had always been doing exactly this and was glad to have it acknowledged. She went back, and Maris went back to the accounts. On the 4th day, Caspian came to Mr. Queller's house, and Queller left them in the study, and Maris laid her full document before him on the table, the figures, the pattern, the sum total, the name of every account, the comparative rainfall data that had first flagged the drainage discrepancy, and the forged letter alongside the 3 real ones, all of it ordered and dated and cross-referenced. He read it in silence. He read it with the kind of attention she had watched him give the drainage summary on the day he had asked about her boots and the wet fields. When he finished, he did not say "well done" or "I had no idea," both of which would have been false. He said, "Eleanor, the last real letter I sent her brother was in condolence, the month she died." He said, "I did not know it would be a weapon." She said, "Most things are only weapons in the wrong hands." He said, "A generous interpretation." She said, "I deal in accurate interpretations." He said, "I know." He looked at the document she had assembled, and he said, You built this from the public accounts. Anyone could have done it. She said, anyone with my father's library and a pair of boots and access to the cellar log, he said, and this was the second time, unmistakable, wider, with an attention in it that she decided to examine later. Yes, anyone with all of that. She gathered the document and said, then I suppose we are ready. He said, Maris. She stopped. He said, the 3 days I asked for. I was trying to establish that the letters were forgeries before I brought them forward. I did not want to accuse my brother on evidence I had not verified. She said, carefully, that is the kind of caution I understand. He said, I know you do. She left and went to work on the question that would break the witness. The question had been her last problem. She had the documents, the forged letter, the comparative accounts, Agnes's testimony, and Caspian's 3 originals. What she did not yet have was the direct link between Croft the steward and Renwick. The money, the mechanism, the proof of instruction rather than independent theft. She had the payment letter Agnes had seen, but that letter was gone. Renwick would have recovered it long since. She needed Croft himself, and she needed him to crack. And the only tool that would crack him was one question whose answer he would not realize he was giving until he had given it. She thought about this for 2 days, and on the morning before the hearing she had it. The trustees arrived on a gray Thursday. Mr. Pemberton, a retired barrister of 60, wide and thorough, who had administered the Eldenmere Trust since the old lady's first husband had died, and Miss Orla Pemberton, his sister, who was 64 and had been named co-trustee because Lady Eldenmere had not trusted anyone who had not faced some difficulty, and Orla Pemberton had raised 6 children on a small income with a sequentially unwell husband, and had emerged from it with an economy of manner that Maris respected on sight. They assembled in the Ashmore Hall library. Queller had judged it the appropriate ground. It was the estate's own formal chamber. It held records, and they brought 3 chairs to a table and placed themselves across it, and Maris and Caspian sat on one side, and Renwick, who had received his summons and come in a coat of such immaculate gray that it looked like an argument, sat on the other, with Croft the steward at his elbow. Agnes stood by the window. She had not been asked to stand there. She had simply gone there, and no one had moved her. Mr. Pemberton explained the purpose, a review of estate accounts following concerns raised by the Duchess of Eldenmere. He said the word Duchess without inflection, and Maris noted that Renwick's jaw moved very slightly in a particular way that she stored. Miss Pemberton said, Mrs. Aldred, you have assembled a document. Would you present it? She stood. She presented it. She was not theatrical about it. She read the figures plainly, and the comparison plainly, and the sum plainly, and she said what the sum represented, and she laid the document before the trustees and pointed to each entry as she spoke, and the room was very quiet. A sparrow was singing outside the east window. No one else made any sound. Renwick, when she had finished, said, with the precise warmth of the mildly amused, "These are accounting discrepancies, not evidence of instruction." She said, "Yes, that is why I have also brought this." She placed the forged letter on the table, and beside it the 3 originals from Caspian, and she held each pair to the window, light one at a time, so that the curve of the E and the angle of the T were visible to the room. She said, "The handwriting is studied, but not accurate. The cross-stroke is centered. In every original it falls left. The final stroke of the E curves downward. In every original it curves up. I have samples across 64 documents in these shelves, if the trustees wish to verify." Miss Pemberton looked at the letters, and then looked at Maris with an expression of someone updating an assessment, and said, "That will not be necessary." Mr. Pemberton said. Mr. Croft sat very still. Mr. Pemberton said, "You countersigned the quarterly accounts. Were you aware of the discrepancies at the time of signing?" Croft said, with an evenness she recognized as prepared. "I relied on the merchant statements as delivered." She said, "Mr. Croft." She said it simply, and the room gave her the space. She said, "When did you last visit the estate wine cellar to verify the stock against the billing?" The silence that followed had a texture to it. It was the silence of a man who is prepared for many questions, and not that one, because it appeared simple, because it was in fact a trapdoor. He said, and the hesitation was small but present, "The steward's practice," she said, and she kept her voice as warm and level as she could. "It is a simple matter of dates, Mr. Croft." "When did you last physically visit the cellar?" he said. "I do not recall the precise," she said, "because you never did." "The billing has been wrong for 31 months. The cellar log shows no steward's visit in that period. If you had relied on the merchant's statements honestly, you would have found cause to verify within the first quarter. You did not verify because you knew the statements were wrong and you had agreed they should be." She paused. She said very quietly, "Who agreed that with you?" He looked at Renwick. It was not a long look. It was the look of a man who has stepped on ice and, having felt it give, turns instinctively toward the shore. He looked at Renwick, and then he looked away, and it was already done. Miss Pemberton said, "Mr. Croft, the truth of the full arrangement, please," and the ice held him no longer. He spoke for some time. He spoke with the exhausted accuracy of a man who has been carrying something heavy up a long stair and has finally set it down on a landing, even the wrong one. He spoke of 31 months of overcharging across 7 accounts, a proportion of the surplus remitted quarterly to a bank draft in Renwick Aldred's name, and of a promise, vague, never committed to paper, always deniable, that when Renwick inherited, Croft would be retained and rewarded. He spoke of Eleanor, whose death 4 years before had left her brother in a grief that had eventually curdled into resentment toward the house that had not saved her, and toward the man who had stood at her grave in composure so controlled it had looked, to Croft, like indifference. He spoke, at the end of the letter, how he had studied Caspian's handwriting across 6 months of estate correspondence, how Renwick had sourced the paper, how they had together arrived at the wording, how Renwick had been the one to place it among Caspian's desk papers for eventual discovery. He said all of this into the grain of the library table, and when he finished, the sparrow outside had stopped. The silence held for 3 full seconds, which in that room felt like something that had to be crossed on foot. Then Renwick said, and it was the first time she had heard anything behind the warmth, a thin, cold vein of something that was, in the end, simply fear. "Croft." His voice was impeccable. Only his hands, which had been very still throughout, made a single small movement on the table surface, a drawing inward, and she reread it in the same instant as what it was, the gesture of a man who has lost the thing he wanted and knows it, and is reaching, even briefly, for what the losing feels like. She had catalogued that gesture as satisfaction. She reread it now as grief, the arithmetic of a second son, counting what he was owed, finding it gone again. "Mr. Pemberton said, Mr. Aldred," he was addressing Renwick. Renwick said nothing. "Mr. Pemberton said, the trustees will convene privately." He said it with the gentleness of a man who understands that an ending is an ending and does not need to be announced loudly. Caspian and Maris stood in the hall. The closed library door was 10 feet away. He said, "You asked him about the cellar." She said he had to have been there, or to not have been. There was no third answer. He said, "You knew he had never been." She said, "I inferred it from the pattern. I did not know until he confirmed it. He said, "The difference matters to you." She said, "Accuracy matters to me." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I did marry you to spite my brother. That was true when I said it." She looked at him. She said, "And now?" He said, with the same quietness he gave everything, the quietness that was not emptiness, but its opposite. "And now I married you because your father taught you about drainage and you were willing to get your boots wet," he said. "And because you read Eleanor's letter in the light of a candle for long enough to see the E's turning down," he said. "And because when I asked you to trust me 3 days and you had every reason not to, you trusted the evidence instead, which is better than trusting me and more than I deserved." She said, "That is a long way to say something," he said, and it was fully realized now, unhurried, with a warmth that had been under the stillness the whole time, like a fire burning in a room you had not yet entered. "I do not have a shorter version." She said, after a moment that she took for her own reasons, "You said you would set the standard higher." He said, "I did say that." She said, "Then I'll hold you to it." He said, "I hope you will." The library door opened, and they went back in. The trustees' formal conclusions were delivered that afternoon. Croft's stewardship was terminated. The matter referred to the relevant legal authority in quiet terms that made prosecution possible, but not announced. A contained arrangement that protected the tenants and the household from the spectacle of a public trial. The accounts were to be audited and restitution made over 18 months from Renwick's personal income, a figure that was not comfortable but not ruinous, and which Pemberton had calculated, Maris suspected, with the specific precision of a man who understood that ruin is not a useful outcome for anyone in a county where people have to live beside each other. Renwick himself was spoken to, privately, in the library before he left, and Caspian went in alone and was in there 20 minutes, and when he came out his face had the look of a man who has put down something he has carried too long. He said only, "He will go to the Dorset property." He said he lost her too. The name was Eleanor's. She did not ask what had passed between them. She believed she understood the shape of it. Agnes, when the trustees had gone, appeared at Maris's side with the expression of a woman who has performed an act of considerable consequence and is going to be sensible about it, and said, "Shall I have Mrs. Hatch put the kettle on?" Maris said, "Please." Agnes said, "It's been a long week." Maris said, "It has." Agnes said, "Mr. Queller left a very good seed cake." Maris said, "Then let's have it." Agnes said, "And I took the liberty, ma'am, of letting the sparrow back out through the east window, as it had come in during the proceedings and was sitting on the account books." Maris looked at her. She said, "Thank you, Agnes." Agnes said, "It seemed right to give it the ending." She left, and for the first time in some weeks, Maris laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and she put her hand over her mouth, and when she took it away, Caspian was looking at her, with the full version of the thing she had been watching him approach for 2 months, and he said, with the simplicity of a man who has stopped managing himself for a moment, "That is the first time I have heard. You laugh." She said, "I have not had much occasion." He said, "I intend to remedy that, if you are willing." She said, "Tell me why I should be willing." He said, "I can't give you a reason that isn't self-interested." She said, "Try anyway." He said, "Because I have watched you read a drainage account and a forgery, and a county mourning, and a man's face from across a dinner table. And you have been right in every case, and I should like very much to be the person you are reading for the rest of my life." She said, "That is still self-interested." He said, "Yes." He said, "But I mean the life part plainly. The rest of it, whatever you make of it, is yours to keep." She said, "That is a great deal to offer a woman whose ring is in a collection plate," he said, reaching into his coat pocket, and he had it. He had gone to the church first, before he had come to Queller's house, which she had not known until this moment, and which she did not know what to do with. Then here it is back. He held it out. He said, "Marry me, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She looked at the ring in his hand, and she thought of the collection plate, and the copper pennies, and the east window, and the sparrow, and the 4 miles to Ashmore Cross, and she said, "I'll need to look at that standard of yours before I agree to anything." He said, "Name a reasonable interval." She said, "A week." He said, 3 days. She said, "Done." They were married again. The same marriage continued, and the second time was a Tuesday, which was after all the day things happened in Ashmore. Agnes wept at the back of the church with a handkerchief she had borrowed from Mr. Queller and returned pressed and folded, and Mr. Queller himself, who had been asked as a matter of form whether anyone had a reason these two should not be joined, said, "None that hasn't been thoroughly dealt with," and someone in the pews laughed, and it turned out to be Miss Pemberton, who had come uninvited and contributed a very good cake. Mrs. Hatch had made one as well, so they had 2, and the surplus was sent to the farm families on the estate, along with a note in Maris's hand explaining that the accounts had been reviewed and the forthcoming quarter would include a correction in their favor, which several of them framed. Renwick went to Dorset and took up, in time, the management of that small property with an attention to detail that surprised everyone who had known him in Ashmore. He wrote Caspian a letter that Caspian showed to Maris and which she read once and handed back without comment, because some accounts are private. Croft served a quietly arranged period of repayment and kept a small position in a neighboring county that Queller had arranged on the grounds that a man with a genuine expertise, badly directed, is not the same as a man without one. Agnes was given the housekeeper's full authority the following spring, which she had already been exercising for some months without the title. Mr. Queller was visited every other Thursday and taught Maris to play chess badly for 6 months, and then confessed he had been playing slowly on purpose, and she made him start again properly, and he won 3 games in 4 after that, and was very satisfied. Miss Pemberton joined them on alternate weeks, and the cake was always excellent. The drainage account discrepancy, when fully corrected and the records brought in order, turned out to have concealed a small additional fund that Lady Eldenmere had established quietly over 12 years, accumulating in a misclassified line item with such deliberate subtlety that Maris was the first person in the household to find it. The fund, when she calculated its total, was earmarked in the old lady's own hand, a note tucked inside the account book's back cover, in writing that had grown spidery at the end, for the repair of the solicitor's library at Ashmore, which had suffered flood damage 14 years before and had never been properly restored. The note said, for the books, if someone is ever willing to notice. Maris had the library repaired. She put her father's name on the door, which she had not been asked to do, and which nobody questioned. Nearly a year after that Tuesday in the church, she was standing at the east window of the library when she heard wheels on the gravel, and she did not move away, and Caspian came and stood beside her, and they watched a hired carriage come up the drive with someone's luggage piled on top in the morning light, and he said, "Are you expecting someone?" She said, "No." He said, "Nor am I." She said, "Then let us find out." They did not move yet. The gravel caught the early sun, and the sparrow that lived in the east window sill, she was nearly certain it was the same one, was conducting its own business on the sill with an air of thorough professional absorption, the way a small creature goes about a large world. Caspian's hand found hers where it rested on the window frame, without announcement, the way it did now, and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her. And she said, very quietly, to the window, "It is the only reason I will take." He said nothing, because they had learned by now that some accounts are settled in the currency of silence, and this was one. The light moved on the floor the way light does when it has nowhere particular to be, and the sparrow sang on, and the carriage came to a stop in the gold of the morning, and the day opened. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one nobody crossed the room for, and then found the whole room turned, then you know what Maris carried home in that oak chest, and what she chose to do with it. Come and sit with us a while longer. There is always a chair here, and the fire has been kept, and the kettle has learned to wait. We would love to know, what was the moment it turned for you? Was it the ring in the plate? Or the E curving the wrong way in the candlelight, or something else entirely? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. If you'd like to keep a place by this fire, there is a small button that does exactly that, and we would be glad to have you. Until next time, sleep well, be generous with the ones who got your boots wet alongside you, and remember, the way out is always through the middle, in the light, with witnesses.